She said their marriage needed space. But her husband soon learned she had already given that space to another man. Ethan never questioned the stability of his marriage until the day Claire sat him down and explained that she felt overwhelmed, disconnected, and unsure of who she was becoming. She framed it as a personal struggle rather than a relationship issue, insisting that the pressure of adulthood had compressed her sense of identity and that she needed time to breathe. Ethan took her words seriously, believing that stepping back emotionally while still supporting her would help restore the balance she claimed to have lost. He loved her in a quiet, dependable way, and that love made him accept the idea of distance even when it felt unnatural. Claire spoke about growth, self-discovery, and reflection, describing the space she requested as temporary and healthy, the kind of reset that could strengthen them in the long run. Ethan believed her. He adjusted his expectations, gave her time alone, picked up extra responsibilities, and tried to maintain patience. She drifted toward independence he hadn't anticipated. At first, the changes were subtle. Claire spent more evenings outside, under the guise of needing fresh air or mental clarity. She took longer walks, extended gym sessions, spontaneous errands, all presented as harmless actions meant to clear her head. Ethan noticed her becoming more protective of her phone, more selective in what she shared about her day, more withdrawn in conversations that once flowed easily. Yet he told himself it was part of the process. She had requested. Space, after all, was not supposed to feel comfortable. Weeks passed, and Claire's need for distance evolved into something resembling reinvention. She updated her appearance, shifted her wardrobe to bolder choices, and adopted routines that placed her increasingly outside the home. Ethan admired her efforts to change, even if he couldn't fully understand them. He kept reminding himself that marriage sometimes required enduring the phases that felt confusing or uneven. The idea that her transformation could be rooted in something other than personal growth never crossed his mind. The first sign of truth emerged on an evening when Ethan returned home earlier than usual. Claire had told him she planned to visit a friend to unwind, but her car was still in the driveway. Inside, the house was quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than peaceful. Ethan moved through the rooms with a sense of curiosity rather than suspicion, assuming Claire might have changed her plans or simply forgotten to mention it. When he reached her office, he noticed her phone on the desk, screen lit with notifications. Names he didn't recognize flashed across the screen, accompanied by messages that felt too personal to belong to casual acquaintances. Every alert carried a tone of familiarity that contradicted the space she had claimed to need. Ethan picked up the device, not to invade her privacy, but because the volume of messages made it impossible to ignore. The preview text revealed just enough context to shift something inside him. Compliments, inside jokes, references to moments he did not recognize. Each message suggested a connection that extended far beyond simple friendship. Still, Ethan placed the phone back where it was, not fully prepared to confront the implications. That night, Claire returned with an energy that did not match someone seeking solitude or clarity. She carried herself with the subtle glow of someone who had spent time in an environment that filled her rather than drained her. Ethan noticed the shift instantly, though he said nothing. He observed her closely in the days that followed, recognizing a pattern he had overlooked. The space she had asked for had never been about introspection. It had been about making room for someone else. Ethan didn't voice his suspicions yet. Instead, he watched as her absences grew more frequent, her excuses more predictable, and her expressions more detached. The truth formed slowly, but unmistakably. Claire had already opened the boundary she requested, not to rediscover herself, but to build a world where Ethan was no longer the central figure. Ethan began noticing details that once would have slipped past him without meaning. Small inconsistencies that stitched themselves into a quiet pattern he could no longer ignore. Claire's schedule, once predictable and grounded in shared routine, now bent around pockets of time she guarded with misplaced confidence. She claimed she needed long drives to clear her thoughts, yet her car returned with mileage that suggested destinations far beyond familiar routes. She insisted she was focusing on self-improvement, Yet her energy seemed invested elsewhere, redirected into an excitement she tried unsuccessfully to disguise. Ethan observed without confrontation, hoping clarity might come without the need for conflict. But the distance between them grew into something tangible. Claire had become a visitor in her own home, slipping in and out without the spontaneity of genuine independence. Her presence lacked the warmth he once relied on, replaced by a nervous composure that hinted at guilt she refused to acknowledge. Ethan felt himself shifting from patient partner to silent witness, caught between wanting to protect what they had built and recognizing that the structure had already begun to fracture long before he realized it. The unraveling became unmistakable when he discovered an unfamiliar jacket hanging in the hallway closet. It wasn't hers, and it certainly wasn't his. It carried a scent that did not belong in their home, a subtle cologne with a confident sharpness that suggested a man who moved through life with assurance. Claire brushed off the discovery with casual explanations that sounded rehearsed, but her eyes betrayed a tension she couldn't conceal. Still, Ethan chose restraint, not out of denial, but out of a desire to gather understanding rather than act impulsively. Over the next weeks, patterns solidified into certainty. Claire's need for quiet evenings outside the house aligned suspiciously with nights when she returned carrying an air of fulfillment that had nothing to do with meditation or introspection. She was softer, lighter, moving with a confidence he had rarely seen during their years together. Ethan realized she wasn't lost or confused, she was invigorated, and whatever she sought, she wasn't seeking it alone. The final confirmation arrived unexpectedly when Ethan went to retrieve Claire's coat from the back seat of her car. As he opened the door, a folded restaurant receipt slipped onto the pavement. The establishment was far from town, a place known for intimate atmosphere rather than casual dining. The receipt listed to entrees, a bottle of wine, and a time stamp that matched an evening she had claimed to spend walking by the river. Ethan felt no explosive anger, no crushing heartbreak, just a quiet recognition that the truth had finally stepped out of shadow. Claire had not been using space to heal or reflect. She had been using it to make room for another man, someone who filled the emotional and physical gaps she refused to articulate. That night, Ethan lay awake in the stillness of the living room, replaying the gradual shift of their marriage. It became clear that Claire's request for space had never been about distance from stress or internal confusion. It had been a reallocation of energy from one relationship to another. She had framed it as growth, but it was escape. She had painted it as introspection, but it was deception. As Ethan pieced the truth together, he experienced a surprising sense of calm. The hurt was present, but muted by the clarity of understanding. This was not a sudden betrayal. It was a slow transfer of loyalty disguised as emotional struggle. Claire had already left in spirit long before she physically stepped away. And now Ethan knew with certainty that the space she insisted they needed had never been intended to preserve their marriage. It had been designed to soften the revelation of the new life she was already living just beyond the edges of his awareness. As the truth settled into place, Ethan found himself moving through life with a strange combination of heaviness and clarity. He no longer searched for signs or questioned Claire's motives. Those uncertainties had already answered themselves. Instead, he focused on observing the quiet shifts in her behavior that revealed how deeply she had committed to someone else. Claire grew increasingly protective of her routines, guarding her personal time with an intensity that once would have seemed unnecessary. She chose her outfits with unusual care, applying fragrances he did not recognize and fixing her hair with the kind of precision reserved for moments that mattered. Yet she maintained the illusion of needing emotional distance, still claiming she was overwhelmed and required time alone. Ethan recognized this for what it truly was, not a request for healing, but a strategy to keep him disconnected enough not to interfere. Her absences were no longer accidental or subtle. They were structured, deliberate, repeated with precision. She left the house at similar times each week, always claiming new errands, new commitments, new attempts at personal improvement. But the spark in her expression when she returned betrayed the authenticity of her alibis. Ethan noticed how she entered their home with a softened glow, the quiet satisfaction of someone whose emotional needs were being met elsewhere. She moved differently, carrying a sense of confidence that had nothing to do with introspection and everything to do with the validation she found beyond their marriage. The shift became even clearer when Claire began expressing interest in activities she had once dismissed, adopting preferences and habits that didn't align with her personality but echoed the tastes of someone new. Ethan realized she was slowly reshaping herself to fit another man's world, molding her identity around the presence of someone who filled the spaces she claimed to need for solitude. The moment of full confirmation arrived during an afternoon when Ethan returned early from work due to a power outage. Claire had told him she planned to spend the day reading at a cafe, hoping to clear her mind. When he approached the cafe out of convenience rather than curiosity, he saw her car parked outside, but not in the customer section. Instead, it sat tucked against the side entrance, angled toward a row of smaller businesses. Something felt off, prompting Ethan to walk down the block. There, through the tinted windows of a private fitness studio, he saw Claire stepping out beside a man he had never seen before. Their posture, close but cautious, told him everything. Claire looked relaxed in a way she never was around him anymore, her expression carrying a warmth she had not directed toward him in months. The man spoke with a familiarity that suggested their connection had grown far beyond casual encounters. Ethan felt a quiet acceptance wash over him. There was no shock, no collapse, only the steady realization that the truth he had been piecing together had finally revealed itself without ambiguity. Claire had built a second life within the margins of her first, using the language of personal growth to conceal her emotional investment in someone else. When she returned home that evening, carrying her usual complicate, Ethan recognized the faint shift in her eyes as she saw him waiting. She had not expected him to be there. She moved with a subtle stiffness, as if the presence of her two realities brushing against each other unsettled her balance. Ethan said nothing, not because he feared confrontation, but because the necessity of understanding had already been satisfied. Claire's actions were no longer hidden behind excuses. She had crossed the point where her need for space had transformed into a new commitment she was too afraid to admit. Ethan understood that she wasn't lost or searching for herself. She had already found something or someone and had left him emotionally long before comprehension reached him. And in that realization, Ethan felt the first stirrings of a future where the weight of her deception no longer belonged to him. In the days after Ethan witnessed the truth with his own eyes, something inside him shifted from searching to settling. He no longer monitored Claire's movements or questioned her excuses. He simply allowed himself to observe the unfolding distance with a calm that surprised even him. Claire continued drifting between two versions of her life, crafting explanations that no longer matched her behavior, returning home with an energy that revealed more than she intended. She acted as though the structure of their marriage remained intact simply because she avoided acknowledging its deterioration. Ethan realized she was clinging to the illusion of stability while investing her emotions elsewhere, preserving the appearance of commitment to avoid confronting the reality she had created. She moved through the house with increasing detachment, gravitating towards silent corners and late-night routines that shielded her from accountability. Her requests for solitude became more frequent, but carried none of the vulnerability they once did. Instead, her distance felt rehearsed, a script she recited to maintain the separation she needed to sustain her double life. Ethan noticed how she avoided eye contact when returning from her outings, dropping her keys with the careful precision of someone trying not to disrupt a fragile balance. Her voice lost its warmth, replaced by a measured politeness that hinted at guilt she wouldn't admit. Yet she still acted as though their marriage existed in a suspended state, waiting for her to regain clarity rather than unraveling under the weight of her choices. Meanwhile, Ethan focused on his own life with renewed purpose. He arrived early to work, took on new responsibilities, and rediscovered interests that had faded under the pressure of maintaining a relationship that no longer nurtured him. The more he invested in his personal growth, the more he recognized how much energy he had spent just trying to keep Claire grounded. Without the constant strain of her emotional volatility, he found himself reconnecting with friends he had unintentionally drifted from, opening up to a world he had neglected in favor of a marriage that had been quietly slipping away. The contrast between their trajectories became undeniable. Ethan grew steadier while Claire became increasingly unmoored. The world she was building with the other man seemed to require constant maintenance, a delicate balance of secrets and stolen moments that left her exhausted. Her returns home carried the weight of someone juggling too many versions of herself, each demanding energy she no longer possessed. One evening, Ethan noticed Claire lingering in the doorway after coming in late. She hesitated before entering fully, as though crossing the threshold required slipping back into a role she no longer fit. Her expression held a flicker of uncertainty, a momentary recognition that Ethan was not the passive figure she assumed he would remain. She watched him with a caution that suggested she sensed the shift in his perspective, though she didn't understand its depth. Days later, her phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter while she showered. Ethan didn't need to read anything to understand the pattern. The frequency, the timing, the persistent tone, it matched the rhythm of someone who believed she still had Claire's full attention. And though Ethan still refrained from looking through her private messages, he found a quiet reassurance in knowing that truth required no additional investigation. It had already revealed itself in countless unspoken ways. Claire's behavior became increasingly inconsistent, her attempts to navigate to lives growing more frantic behind the mask of composure. The man she was seeing had begun demanding more of her time, leaving her torn between obligations she could no longer juggle with ease. Ethan recognized the signs of strain, watching as her once confident steps faltered and her carefully constructed narratives cracked along the edges. Despite the chaos forming beneath her calm facade, Claire never acknowledged the shift directly. She still insisted she needed space, still pretended her absences were innocent, still masked her choices under the guise of emotional struggle. But Ethan knew she was inching toward a breaking point where her two worlds would inevitably collide. The balance she fought to maintain could not hold forever, and as Ethan observed her attempts to keep the illusion alive, he realized he no longer feared the collapse. He welcomed the clarity it would bring. The collapse arrived not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, inevitable unraveling of a life stretched too thin. Claire's dual existence finally began slipping beyond her ability to manage, and Ethan saw the signs the moment she stepped into the house one evening with a tension she could no longer hide. Her movements were sharp, her expression unsettled, as if the structure she depended on had shifted beneath her feet. She lingered near the entryway, hesitating as though stepping further into the home required confronting a reality she had avoided for months. Ethan didn't question her, didn't prompt her, didn't offer the emotional buffer she had grown accustomed to. He simply observed, understanding that whatever she carried now belonged to a world that no longer included him. Over the next days, her unease intensified. The messages she once concealed with confidence became distractions she could not ignore. Her attempts to maintain distance from Ethan faltered, not because she sought reconnection, but because her focus splintered under the weight of the man demanding more than stolen moments. She began disappearing abruptly, returning with eyes clouded by conflict rather than excitement, revealing through her demeanor that the relationship she thought would provide freedom had instead created new boundaries she did not anticipate. Ethan watched with a calm that stemmed from acceptance rather than indifference. He no longer searched for reasons or explanations. Claire's turmoil spoke clearly enough. She had stepped into a world built on the attention of someone who valued the thrill of pursuit, but hesitated at the responsibilities that followed. When her new partner finally pressured her to choose commit fully or step back, she found herself stranded between two lives she no longer recognized. Ethan noticed the shift when she began staying home more often, drifting through rooms with a lost expression that suggested she no longer knew where she belonged. Her energy dimmed, her routines faltered, and the confidence she once carried dissolved into uncertainty. She hovered near Ethan with the subtle hope that familiarity might anchor her, yet she avoided direct acknowledgement of the choices that led her here. She seemed to expect tolerance without understanding that the version of him willing to wait had disappeared months ago. The moment of clarity arrived one afternoon when Claire finally confessed, not through dramatic admission, but through the quiet resignation of someone who had run out of excuses. She expressed regret woven into vague reflections about mistakes and misunderstandings, avoiding specifics while revealing enough to confirm everything Ethan already knew. Her message was simple. The relationship she pursued had fallen apart, and she no longer knew what to do next. Ethan felt no satisfaction, no resentment, only a calm recognition that the path she walked had finally reached its natural conclusion. He responded with firmness wrapped in kindness, acknowledging her turmoil without offering himself as a safety net. He made it clear that while he wished her well, their marriage had ended long before she realized it. There was no anger in his words, only the steady truth that his healing had begun the moment he stopped chasing explanations. Claire absorbed his response with a heavy stillness, not arguing or pleading, simply accepting what she could no longer avoid. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as the quiet constant she could return to, but as a man who had stepped forward without her. After she moved out, the house shifted into a peaceful rhythm Ethan hadn't felt in years. He reorganized the rooms, adjusting the space to reflect the life he was choosing rather than the one he had endured. He reconnected with friends, embraced new routines, and found clarity in the quiet moments that once felt empty. Now they felt expansive. Claire faded into the background of his life, a chapter that had shaped him but no longer defined him. Her journey continued somewhere beyond his reach, marked by lessons she had created for herself. Ethan felt no obligation to follow her story. His own had only just begun, and as he settled into a future no longer overshadowed by deception, he understood that the space she claimed to need had ultimately given him something far more valuable: the freedom to rebuild a life grounded not in illusion, but in truth.